Okay. Well, good evening, everyone here at the CAC, as well as those who are tuning in virtually on YouTube. We're just delighted to welcome you tonight to Brian Svoboda's talk, My Czech Pilgrimage, Seeking Faith, Family, and Fortitude in Your Ancestral Homeland. He's an incredible teacher, and he will be just the professor tonight. So I think you'll enjoy this story, which appeared in the Christmas 2024 edition of the Lamp magazine. We actually have some copies of that outside in our bookstore, so you're welcome to take a look there. I myself know Brian from the Catholic Information Center. He is our current chairman of the board, but he's also a man with the biggest servant's heart possible. He's just always volunteering, helping anybody here and there, meeting with young professionals to give them guidance and advice on life issues, career, etc. He's a wonderful man, and he's also a fourth generation Czech-American. So for me, when I think of Brian, I think of Nebraska and his love of Nebraska football. He's also a Virginian, and we're fairly close neighbors in Northern Virginia, which is wonderful. Something very special is that this week, Brian's ancestors arrived in America 150 years ago. So it's something to celebrate, and it's a story of all our own. We also, excuse me, I had a little hiccup right there. I apologize. I just want to explain the schedule. Brian will be giving his wonderful presentation, which will also incorporate time for Q&A. Colleen or I will be walking around with a mic if you want to ask a question. And that will be followed by a very light happy hour with some Czech beer that our great host and presenter has gifted all of us. So we'll enjoy that afterwards. Tonight's program is happening also thanks to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And we have Karina Lipsman, who is the Director of Government Relations over there, here to just say a few words. But VOC is an amazing nonprofit. It's an educational, research, and human rights nonprofit organization that's devoted to commemorating the more than 100 million people killed by communism around the world, and to pursuing the freedom of those still living under totalitarian regimes. They also have a magnificent, it's truly magnificent, museum that is they're our neighbor. So if you ever have the opportunity, please visit the VOC Museum just on McPherson Square as well. That's basically it, and I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Karina Lipsman.
You've done such a wonderful job of selling us, so I don't even know anything else to say. No, I'm just kidding. Well, good evening, fellow Virginian. I'm a fellow Virginian as well. So my name is Karina Lipsman. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and we are very excited to be hosting alongside with the Catholic Information Center this evening. And it's truly a privilege to be gathered here with Brian Svoboda. And as some of you may or may not know, Svoboda actually means freedom or liberty in Russian and other Slavic languages, so kind of fitting. And very excited to be gathered here as he shares his deeply personal journey to the Czech Republic and the remarkable insights that he's gained through that experience. His story goes beyond just the discovery of his family's heritage. It's a story about resilience, faith, and the enduring human spirit, values that are incredibly close to our hearts at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So before Brian gives his presentation that we're very excited about, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the important work that we do at VOC. Angela did a fantastic job of selling us and kind of giving a background of our mission, but we do much more than that. We not only commemorate those who have suffered under communist regimes, but we also shed light on those who are currently living in communist regimes. And just because the Berlin Wall fell does not mean that communism as a whole fell. And so we pride ourselves in being the schoolhouse for the next generation to teach them how democracy is one of the most important experiments that we've ever had in our lifetime, and that we need to preserve it, and just the evil ideology that is communism. And we've done a study in 2020 that we did a poll of Gen Zers, and it was almost 30% that commemorate or sympathize with a socialist communist regime. And this is part of the reason why we still exist, and part of the reason that we continue to bring people into our museum. So I would strongly, strongly encourage you to visit. Bring school groups, send school groups to us. We would like to make sure that we continue to live and enjoy our liberties and freedom. So with that, I also have a very personal connection. I was born and raised in Soviet Ukraine. I came over when I was 8 years old. I experienced communism, so that's why the work with victims of communism is so important, and why your journey is extremely interesting to me, because you just never know who you're going to stumble upon, the stories that you're going to hear from different people, and it's always inspiring. So tonight's is a beautiful reminder of the strength and resilience of those who have come before us. Brian's journey and his reflection on his Czech heritage are powerful examples of how our roots, our families, and the courage of others can continue to shape and inspire us. So to give a little bit of background about Brian, he is a fourth-generation Czech-American who recently embarked on a deeply personal pilgrimage to his family's homeland. Brian's journey took him to explore his ancestral roots and learn more about the people who lived through the historic Velvet Revolution of 1989, when the Czech people peacefully overthrew communist rule. This journey inspired an article that was published in the Christmas 2024 issue of The Lamp, where he shares the reflections on his travels and the powerful lessons he learned along the way. And with that, I am very honored to welcome Brian Svoboda and look forward to hearing your story. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Karina, and thank you, Angelica. With all these nice words, I'm really glad I brought the good beer tonight. I want to thank, first off, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, with whom we at the CIC have a very special affinity. They are our neighbors not only by geography, but also intellectually. Lee Edwards, who was the founding director of the foundation, was a longtime denizen of the CIC. You saw him here all the time. And so it's a connection that's very special to us, and I'm very grateful that they participated this evening. And also like to thank The Lamp magazine for printing my article and also making copies available for the CIC. I did not realize until my article was published that they've sent copies of their magazine to the CIC on a regular basis, which, number one, is a great enticement to come here and shop here, buy the books, buy the magazines, buy other things. But also, I mean, to get that magazine in its printed form is just really something to behold. It's a beautifully made magazine, and we're grateful for their support. And then thanks to the CIC and Angelica, who was sort of the prime mover behind this talk tonight, for which I'm very grateful. So you might wonder, why is there a picture of a big ship here, on the display? Well, you're here for the opening event in what I would call Czechapalooza, which is that 150 years ago this Wednesday, my great-great-grandparents, Matej and Josefa Svoboda, came to the United States from Bohemia and arrived in Baltimore 150 years ago on Wednesday. So this is the Matej Svoboda family. I found this just a few days ago, actually. I didn't know this picture existed. And their journey was, I wouldn't be here if they hadn't came, literally. So this is a very special week to have this conversation. And what I want to talk about just very briefly tonight is sort of two things. The first is the trip I took with my wife Sheila back last year and what we saw, just sort of describing it as it happened. And then a few reflections on what we think it may have meant. and talking about the ideas that sort of came out to us, from the trip. And then I hope at the end we'll have a little time, for conversation. Q&A sounds like such an ugly world. It sounds like I'm going to cold call you in class. I remember coming to an event at the CIC where Father James Shaw of Georgetown University was giving the talk. And as he was giving the talk, he would walk up to a random person in the crowd, get about 6 inches from their face, and talk to them as if to pretend that they weren't there. It was the most unnerving thing I'd ever seen in my life. When I teach, every so often when I see a student losing attention, I do that, and it works. But we're not going to do that tonight. So what happened? So as Angelica mentioned, I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. I did not have like a rural my Aunt and Nia experience. I grew up in suburbia. I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. So my childhood was like out of a Steven Spielberg movie. And I wasn't particularly interested in my ancestry pretty much all of my life. I was a little bit like Fred Savage, in The Princess Bride, where Peter Falk comes in to read him the story, and it's like, yeah, right, whatever, I don't want to listen to this. And that was what I was like for pretty much all my life. And then my father died. And there was something about that process that created sort of a desire, for belonging, for context, to try to understand where you came from and to, find a connection that seemed as if it had been lost. And so when Dad passed away, one of the things that he had, sort of the document of the Svoboda family, was the Centennial Appleton Parish Directory. This was the 100th anniversary book that was put out for the people who had settled in Butler County, Nebraska in 1875. And there, in the book is Matej and Josefa Svoboda, who are my great-great grandparents. So Matej and Josefa were the settlers. Their son Anton came with them. That's Anton Svoboda and his wife Katie Kovar. They were farmers in Butler County, Nebraska. Their son was my grandfather, Anton Svoboda Jr., who was a custodian in David City, Nebraska. He moved off the farm and moved into a house in David City, and that's him with my dad. And this is the three of us. You can see I'm just as talkative then as I am now. So one of the interesting things about this directory was it gave me the entire chronology of my family, the entire family tree from Matej and Josefa on down. And it said where Matej and Josefa came from. They came from a village called Hotobudice, which was about 2.5 hours southeast of Prague. If you Google map it, it's about equidistant between Prague and Vienna. And so I had this vague idea after my father died in 2021 that at some point I was going to go to Czech Republic, I was going to go to Hotobudice, and I was going to see where my ancestors came from. I Googled Hotobudice, and it looked like there was nothing there. I mean, you saw ruins of some buildings, not much else. They apparently didn't pay the Google ad, promotion. And so I had low expectations, didn't know how it was going to work. And again, it was one of these things I sort of filed away like, I'm going to do this sometime when it makes sense. And then it happened that I was teaching adjunct at the Catholic University of America, and they have an American law program where they bring American law professors and take them to Krakow, Poland, to teach for a week on different subjects in American law. And so they asked me if I was interested in doing that, and I said, I'm ever so much interested in doing that. And I decided this is my chance. I'm going to fly to Prague. We're going to stay in Prague for a few days before we go to Krakow, and then we're going to go to Hotobudice, and we're going to see the Svobodas. And this was all like a pie-in-the-sky plan. I figured we're going to rent a car, we're going to see whatever's there. If I'm lucky, there's going to be a pub, and there's going to be people who don't speak my language, and I'm going to drink a beer, and I'm going to smile at them, and they're going to smile at me, and then I'm going to leave, and I'm going to feel better about myself. And so I had no plan at all. And then Providence came in. I had worked on Capitol Hill for U.S. Senator Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, and he had his Senate office reunion about 4 or 5 months before we were supposed to go, and I bumped into a fellow Czech descendant named Jim Pribble, and told him about my plan. He said, "Oh, you need to talk to Tom and Marie Zahn." And Tom and Marie Zahn are a couple. Tom grew up in Oregon, and Marie grew up in Prague. They married and they settled in Prague, and their business was to run a genealogy and tour guide service. They would research your ancestors, build your family tree, and then they would take you to wherever it was that your ancestors came from, which was sounded like a great idea to me. So Jim Pribble introduced me to the Zahns, and I engaged them. They said that they would drive me to Huda-Budica, and then we were beginning to plan. And I was thinking at the same time, I was kind of thinking on two tracks. I wanted to see where my ancestors came from, but at the same time, I wanted to have some sort of connection with the people who had been involved in the Velvet Revolution in 1989. That was sort of the path not taken for me professionally. I majored in Soviet politics at the University of Nebraska and graduated, I think, the month that the Czech government collapsed in December of 1989. And so it had interested me. And so I wanted to find some way to meet at least a couple of these people. I had read an excellent book. I should have brought it with me tonight to hold it in front of you. But excellent book called The Long Night of the Watchman by Václav Benda, who was one of the Catholic intellectuals who was a driving force behind Charter 77 and Vones, the committee to defend the unjustly persecuted, and one of the leaders of the revolution. And so I had read that book and seen interviews about it, and that had gotten me interested. And at the same time, I had read some other books, and that was how I came to learn about Bishop Václav Mali. So Václav Mali was a priest. He was ordained a priest in Czechoslovakia in 1976, and almost immediately decided that he wanted to sign Charter 77. And a couple of leaders of the Charter movement took him aside at the time. He was a young priest, just barely ordained, and told him basically, you shouldn't do this. You're not going to be able to serve as a priest. They're going to strip your license. At that time, priests were required to be licensed by the Czech government, and you're not going to be able to fulfill your ministry. But he decided that he was going to do it anyway, and so he did. And it went exactly as was described to him. He was stripped of his license to be a priest. And if you ever have, a bad day or think you're having a bad day, you should consider what Bishop Mali's life was like in the late 1970s and 1980s. This is from an excellent book called Conscience in Captivity by Janice Brown of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And it talked about how Bishop Mali had been a spokesperson for Charter 77 and is a member of Vones. Over the last 8 years, he has not only spoken out fearlessly on a number of occasions, but has also been instrumental in broadcasting the outlook of Cardinal Tomasik. Imprisoned for 7 months in 1979, he has been beaten up many times, has had his nose and jaw broken, has been interrogated weekly and threatened with death. In 1987, he was 4 times offered the chance to emigrate to the West, but he refused. And, in one of life's, Providence's great, improbabilities, it was he who was the moderator of the mass demonstrations in Wenceslas Square in November of 1989. So I did a little looking. This goes back to a story from my own childhood. When I was in the 2nd grade, President Ford was coming to Lincoln, Nebraska, and I decided I wanted to meet President Ford. So I asked my grandfather, not the Czech grandfather, the Danish grandfather, what he thought. And he said, well, you should write your congressman. And so I did. And then one Monday afternoon, the congressman's office calls and says, oh, we have tickets for you to see President Ford. You can come and meet him at the airport. And so I thought, well, I'll try the same thing again. It worked once. So I found an email address for Bishop Mali's secretary on the internet and emailed and said, I'd like to meet, I'm coming from the United States, teaching for the Catholic University of America. I'd like to meet Bishop Mali and receive his blessing. Got an email reply back about 5 days before I was to leave. The only time the bishop can meet with you is at 9:30 on Tuesday morning. I said, great, sold. And so I put it on the calendar. The other person, too, I wanted to see was Monsignor Tomas Halleck. My mother-in-law had gotten me this book some years ago, From the Underground Church to Freedom. Tomas Halleck was an underground priest and a collaborator of Cardinal František Tomasek, who was the primate of Czechoslovakia, and also a co-worker of Pope John Paul II before the Berlin Wall fell. And his priesthood was so secret that not even Cardinal Tomasek knew that he had been ordained a priest until, I think, after the government, had fallen. And so his story, this is an awesome book. I highly recommend reading it. His story was very, very inspiring about the difficulty in finding his vocation, persevering in it, but then finding the fortitude to live it, as, the government was about to fall. So that set the stage for the trip. And those were the plans I made. And needless to say, I was very excited about it. So we went to Prague, and that Monday morning, Marie Zahn pulled in to pick us up at the hotel we were staying, which was just near the Charles Bridge. This was what we saw the moment when we came, and it was very inspiring and very appropriate to the trip. You go through and you see all these monuments to the saints, to the Czech saints and to our Lord and Our Lady, and you see also the place where Saint John Nepomuk was thrown into the river by King Wenceslaus IV for standing up to authority at the time. The little padlocks you see apparently it's supposed to note where engaged couples come when they're dating or something. It's kind of an interesting custom, interesting place to do this. But this was what we saw before we went. And Marie picked us up. Marie had been a teenager in high school at the time of the 1989 revolution. And one of the interesting things about the trip was to hear Marie's story about growing up then. She talked about she grew up in a Catholic family, and the sort of watchword in the house was, don't share your groceries outside the kitchen. Sort of an aphorism meaning, don't talk outside the house about what we're talking about here at home. It's a phenomenon that was familiar to me when I was studying Soviet politics back in the 1980s. It was this concept of the double life. There was the public self that was trying not to get into trouble. There was the private self that was your interaction with the people you trusted, if you could know who it was that you could trust. And she talked about being in Wenceslas Square in 1989. She said everybody was there, and how happy they were when the government fell, and when they didn't have to take Russian classes anymore in her high school, they could take English classes instead, and they viewed that as very much a trade up. And we were driving, we were having this conversation as we were driving, on the main highway out of Prague, and then we, took a turn onto the country roads. And this is an example of one of the sights we saw. We would see every mile or so one of these stone field crosses. These were monuments that were made and placed in the fields where people were farming. They were meant to be objects of contemplation so that people could find a way to encounter our Lord in the course of the workday. And their appearance on this landscape, and it was like seeing a crescendo of these as we were getting closer and closer to Hotobudice. It was a very striking sight. And then finally, all of a sudden, we were there. One of the running jokes of the trip was that I don't really know how to pronounce Hotobudice. Marie gave me like about, 4 different trips, and I think threw her hands up in exasperation. When I met Bishop Molly, I tried to tell him where I'd been, and he didn't understand. I had to write it out, and they went and looked it up. So if you're taking the audio from this presentation hoping to find it, you probably better write it instead. But we arrived in Hotobudice. This is a village of about probably 100 people. I mean, not dissimilar to where, the town, in central Nebraska where my mother was from. And then Marie had a surprise for us when we got there. not only were we going to see the buildings where my ancestors lived, which were still standing, but one of the buildings was still occupied. It was occupied by a Svoboda. He was the mayor of the city. He was a cousin of mine, and we were going to meet him. So she takes us into the town hall, and we meet Mayor Vladimir Svoboda. He was he took us into his office, and one of the interesting things about Vladimir is you could tell he's sort of, and we'll talk about this a little later, he's sort of a convener for the family. I mean, people would come to Hotobudica to try to learn more about the Svobodas or their family, and they would encounter him and they would share information, and then he would share information with you. So when we came there, he had very carefully marked a book that had been initially written in Czech, I think by a member of the Svoboda family, and then translated into English by a couple named Steve and Irene Nashiba from the Pacific Northwest. And it was called Hotobudica, The Life and Times of a Village in Moravia. And it was basically the entire history of the village. And he was showing this to us with great enthusiasm. And so we had a very fun meeting with him in his office. He didn't speak a word of English. We didn't speak a word of Czech. Marie translated for us, but we had a very good conversation. And then he took us across the street to Building 27. This was where the Svobodas had lived since at least 1825, and this is where Vladimir and his family live today. They're farmers. They raise livestock. And you go back and you see the house is sort of bisected. He lives on the right-hand side there. His son, Vladimir, who's also a farmer, lives on the left-hand side with his wife and now his newborn daughter. And you go backwards, you see the farm. If you could see the picture more clearly, you could see a whole bunch of caged rabbits. My wife told me I was not supposed to take pictures of that because my daughter would object to that. But I did anyway. We'll spare you the bunnies, though, this evening. And just looking around, seeing, I mean, the wall, for example, that's a wall that my ancestors would have seen in Bohemia, in 1825. Same with that barn and that tree. And so there was a timelessness to the place. But the real treat was when we went, when we got to meet Vladimir and his son and go into their house where they basically had us in as their company. They brought out a bottle of Slivovitz, plum liquor, and served it to us. We did shots. They brought out what was called head cheese, which was, meat made from the surroundings of the skull of a pig, which I ate it right up, when in Rome, do like the Romans. And I texted my Aunt Doris, my dad's sister, about that when we got back to the hotel, and she said, Mom and Dad used to eat that. I didn't want anything to do with it. But we carried the flag. And we heard the best thing first was getting to meet them, but also hearing the stories that they told about the history of the family. The Svobodas almost lost building number 27 during communism. When the communists took over in 1948, they began to implement a process of dekulakization. They wanted to eliminate the kulaks from the village. If you want to know more about that, there's a very good book called The Harvest of Sorrow by Robert Conquest, which talked about dekulakization in Ukraine and how it was the proximate cause of the Ukrainian famine in 1928 and 1929. The premise was that there were farmers who had too much land, too much livestock, they had too much wealth relative to the rest of the population. They were impeding the progress of communism, and so the property needed to be confiscated, and it needed to be reverted to the state. So they came to Hotobudica in somewhere shortly after the 1948, shortly after the communists came to power, and sent a committee member who made a list of the people who were supposed to be banished, and the Svobodas were on it. And so Svobodas had a plan, though. The villagers took the committee member out to a tavern, they got him drunk, and they stole the list from his pocket. And he was apparently either too lazy or too embarrassed to, he was too lazy to make a new list or too embarrassed to admit that he lost it. And so he let the matter sit. And that was how the Svoboda stayed in Building 27. House almost burned down once too. Sometime, a little later than that, Vladimir was telling us about how the building next door, which was not as well made, was on fire, extremely flammable, and how they spent all night trying to keep the flames from spreading to the house. So it was touch and go for this family at different moments in time. And then finally, we walked down the street and we went to Building 35 where Matej and Josefa, had lived. And that's the Sandy house there on the right is where they lived. And all of this was very moving. Our last stop was when we went to the cemetery and the church in a village called Horny Slatina, about 5 kilometers away from Hodobudice. And the church goes back to the 12th century. It's the Church of St. Giles. We were greeted by a very joyful and exuberant woman, the mayor of Horny Slatina, who came to let us in, show us the parish. You could see what a treat she was to meet. She was very kind to us. And the beauty inside the church, the simplicity and the beauty was really astounding. And what you see on the right is the baptismal font where they got the baptismal water to baptize all my ancestors. And that sanctuary is where my ancestors were married and where they were buried. The records that the Zons had sent us showed the marriage records, the baptismal records, the dates of death. All of that happened, in this village. So it was a really remarkable experience. As I wrote about it, in the lamp, I came thinking that I was going to see this ruined village, but instead, I saw part of a family that was really still truly alive. And ironically, one of the best signs of that was the family plot. That's the Svoboda family plot. It was the best kept up plot in the entire cemetery. It had one of the newest stones. The flowers were fresh. I mean, that we were told that was what you had to do if you wanted to keep the family plot. You had to care for it and commit to put the resources in to do it, because if you didn't, it would revert back to the church and, it would go to someone else. But the Svobodas stepped up, and so that's where my ancestors for generations, have been buried. So it was a very interesting day to meet a family that was still on the ground and, and hear the stories of how they'd had to persevere, through very difficult times. So then the next day, I went to the Archbishop's Palace in Prague. It was the day I was going to meet Bishop Mali. This was Tuesday. And I dressed a little better than that. This is me later in the day. But, I walked there. I was sure to get there early. I went into the lobby. It was a very peaceful atmosphere. I imagine it's probably like, our chanceries, here in this area. The people who were working there were obviously very committed to what they were doing. And the bishop's secretary came and got me and brought me up to his office. And I thought I was just going to meet the bishop and receive his blessing and get out of town. I imagined he was a busy person and he wasn't going to have any time for me. Instead, I come into this room where they've got 2 place settings for coffee and tea, a Ferrero Rocher chocolate for each of us. And, they sit us down. And the bishop greets me and he says, "Would you like coffee, tea, vodka?" I said, "Well, it's a happy coincidence because yesterday I went to see my cousin in Hodobudice and he gave me a bottle of plum liquor to bring home. He said, 'You should have brought it for me.'" And so that was the start to the conversation. Bishop Mali was a very engaging, very perceptive and discerning, and you could tell exacting person. He was very curious about the United States. He was curious about the political situation. He was curious about the relationship with Europe. He was curious about our domestic politics. He asked, if I thought America was still a Christian nation, and asked, how many atheists would you say there are in the United States Congress? Sort of an interesting pop quiz for the campaign finance lawyer and political science major. I think I passed. I hoped, but it was a it was a very moving conversation because all along I was aware of who he was and what he had done. At one point he asked, how did you hear about me? And I told him I'd studied Soviet politics, when I was at the University of Nebraska in 1989. I told him also, that, to meet him would be like going to Boston in 1800 and meeting Samuel Adams. And in fact, I told a friend I was coming to meet him and saying, it'd be like meeting Samuel Adams. My friend said, well, I'm going to meet Samuel Adams tonight. Hoist a bottle. But it was very moving. I mean, this, can I say this is the greatest person I've ever met in my life? I mean, our Lord knows, I suppose, but I can't think of anybody who has accomplished more or suffered through more. And so I was very moved by the experience. I asked for his blessing. He gave it to me. I asked him to bless some holy cards of the infant Jesus of Prague, and he said, Bambino de Praha. He was very happy, and he blessed them. He said, I will bless them in Czech. And so he did. And then I thought we were done, and I was leaving, but then they rushed after me and said goodbye and gave me a book to take home with me. And it was a very, very moving meeting. His secretary walked me out and walked me through the Archbishop's palace and took me to the Archbishop's oratory. And outside the Archbishop's chapel is this portrait of Cardinal František Tomášek. He was the primate of Czechoslovakia during the Soviet occupation, and he was the one who, really stepped up when it came time to stand, with the revolution. He had had a very difficult time as primate. I mean, there was no Episcopal conference in Czechoslovakia to speak of. He had no other bishops with whom he could confer. The church was divided. The communists tried purposefully to create sort of a parallel state-sponsored church. It was an organization called Pacem et Terris, which they took from the Second Vatican Council. The dissidents and the people in Charter 77 called the priests involved in that Pax Terriers, as a sort of form of diminution. And there were times when people wondered whether Cardinal Tomášek was really doing enough to oppose communism on the ground. But he was described, by one writer as a simple, honest man, and I think he was a man of great prudence. And George Weigel writes about this in Witness to Hope as, after Pope John Paul became Pope, he finally got some of the external support that he hadn't really had before, and it led him to be, more courageous, and more vocal in the opposition, in the opposition to communism. And, and so it was fitting that his portrait was there. Tomáš Halík wrote that when Cardinal Tomášek would go into the chapel to pray, that he often felt, completely, utterly alone. And so the thought of that burden that he had to bear was a very striking thought. And so I was very fortunate to be able to see that. It was a wonderful day. It ended when I went to Mass later that night at the Church of St. Salvatore across the Charles Bridge, which was the church of Monsignor Tomáš Halík. I'd done a little more research and found out that Monsignor Halík said Mass, on Tuesday night, and then afterwards, gave an apostolic talk to a group of college students at Charles University. And so I decided I'd go to the Mass. It was a beautiful church, but the most beautiful thing about it was the couple dozen students who were there. I was, probably one of the oldest people in the church. And afterwards, they all followed Monsignor Halík, back into the sacristy. There was part of me that wanted to follow with them, but I realized I wouldn't understand a single word that he was saying or that they were saying. And I sat and made my Thanksgiving instead at the end of what was a very remarkable day. So just very briefly, what did I take, from all of this? I think the two things that sort of, leapt out for me were family and fortitude. On the family side, again, I thought I was going to come and see the ruins of a village that had basically been abandoned, and instead I found the signs of a living and active family. I thought about that yesterday when I went to Mass, when I heard the first reading from Isaiah, where the prophet says, "Remember not the events of the past, the things of long ago consider not. See, I am doing something new. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" So we come to Hodobudica and we see this young family there. Vladimir's son his wife was about to have, Vladimir's first grandchild. We were about to have our first grandchild also. So we saw this, growing, family. The other fun thing to see was Mayor Vladimir as sort of the paterfamilias of this family. The funniest thing happened about 6 months after the trip. I was at my office late one night, and an email comes in from a woman in Omaha, Nebraska, who says, "I took a trip to Hodobudica, just about a week ago, and I met Vladimir Svoboda, who said that you have something called the Appleton Centennial Directory. Do you have a copy of that, and could you share that with me?" I had sent a copy to Vladimir as a gift after we had gotten back, and so I emailed her and said, "Well, yes, I'd be, here it is in PDF, glad to share it with you." But it's like all these people coming to this little village, meeting this person who's serving as like sort of a train master, for all of them, forging connections and building relationships. And it was a very exciting thing to see. And then you saw the picture of the family plot. I mean, a family that, after hundreds of years was continuing to care, for, the people who'd come before them. So this idea of a living family was a big surprise that I didn't expect, that I would see. And then the final thing, before hopefully we have a little bit of conversation, not just about this, but also, maybe analogous stories, in your own lives or, observations on this time and place. The other big thing was fortitude, the virtue of fortitude and what it meant. That had been sort of the driver for me wanting to meet Bishop Molly, which was that here was a person that seemed to me through what he had done had been exemplary in fortitude. And as I saw myself, I really totally was not. And so the idea was that, to somehow see that seemed like a very rewarding thing. But what I think with some contemplation, you begin to think about what is fortitude, really. And, Aquinas, I think, put it, first and best. Fortitude is chiefly about fear of difficult things, which can withdraw the will from following the reason. And, there's a more detailed description, by a Dominican priest, named Jordan Alman, who makes the point that you usually think about fortitude as having to attack, but, but suffering sickness or persecution or to resist an enemy or suffer an evil is a harder thing to do still. It's harder interiorly, spiritually, to defend yourself against an attack or an injustice than it is to attack oneself. And so this idea of of understanding that fortitude is really sort of conforming your conduct to the demands of reason and avoiding or not giving in to the fear that causes you to shirk from doing where reason would leave you, is a good, way of thinking about it. There's an additional point too, which is that fortitude properly understood is tethered to right intention, that you have to not simply be trying to resist evil, but you have to understand what the good is, and you have to be trying to pursue the good, and that requires contemplation. I remember, the priest who was the director here before Father Charles, Father Arnie Panula, giving a talk once where he talked about this idea with the example of Saint Joseph. He talked about he said he intervenes only when necessary. He does so firmly but without violence. Rather than being jealous, rather than being angry, rather than being vindictive, he ponders what to do. He sees the hand of God in these things, that God is asking something specific of him. He was challenged as we are in work and chastity and family relationships. Ask him to help you to have the presence of God in your work that he has in his. So it's fortitude as the fruit of contemplation, trying to discern what the right thing to do is. And as I thought about it, that really was, maybe Bishop Molly's, greatest example. There was a passage that, Monsignor Hollick wrote about him where he really sort of highlighted just the remarkable intellectual discernment that the people in 1989, brought to this process, and how Bishop Molly exemplified it. He talked about how Bishop Molly managed to simulate something that surfaces only at dramatic moments in Czech history: the capacity for effective solidarity, mutual kindly concern, creative reactions, and above all, splendid humor. And we think about that. How much splendid humor do we see in our politics these days? So it's fortitude, I think, properly understood as the fruit of discernment and as and something that we live in ordinary life. I mean, it's all well and good to be asking ourselves, what would I have done if I were in Czech Republic in 1989? But tomorrow I have to ask myself, am I going to get up on time? Am I going to call the client who hasn't paid their bill? Am I going to correct the associate who worked on a project, when I feel uncomfortable doing that? That's the battleground for us. And that's where we have to develop, that virtue. And we hope, that with the grace of God, we don't have to, live it in the way that these people in 1989 had to. So that was what I saw. That was what I understood. And my very last observation on this is that I'm still working to figure out, what it all means. As Pope Benedict wrote, of Mary when he told the story of the finding in the temple, and when, Jesus says to her, did you not know that I had to be in the house of my Father? And she didn't understand what he was saying. Mary's faith is a journeying faith, a faith that is repeatedly shrouded in darkness and has to mature by persevering through the darkness. She keeps it in her heart and allows it gradually to come to maturity there. That was what I tried to do with the article, and it's what I was grateful to be able to do with the talk this evening. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Brian, for just a wonderful talk and so many beautiful lessons from your family and from the history of the Bohemian Czech people. We're just so grateful that you could be here tonight. We're not going to call it a Q&A, but it's kind of like that right now. So if you have any thoughts or questions, please just raise your hand and Colleen will walk around.
Brian, thank you so very much. I'm Mark Michalski. It was fascinating. You mentioned Spielberg's upbringing in your setting in Nebraska. I think that the screenplay that you described or written or spoke is a good story for the part of the world to make it more available to the people about not only fortitude and friendship and family, but also the foundation of it, the courage, the virtue that you described. I have a very simple question because I was fascinated for a long time about the little child of Prague. You mentioned, I know that reading sometimes about Teresa of Lisieux, she was fascinated by small things. She apparently had the miniature of little child of Prague. Which church is it, and have you visited this? Could you tell us more about this?
We did see it. It's in the Church of Our Lady Victorious in Malastrana. It was just about 2 blocks from our hotel, the Hotel Podveži, which I warmly recommend to anybody. And it's a beautiful statue. I'm told that if you go at Christmas time, usually the infant Jesus of Prague wears all of his regalia. There's different suits in the liturgical colors. I mean, so he wore purple when we saw him during Lent. I expect he's wearing purple today. But I'm told that during the Christmas season, he wears nothing at all to allow people to contemplate Christ as a helpless child in a way that they otherwise aren't permitted to do.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Terzi Hartova. I'm here for the first time, and I'm a Czech national. I was very excited to come here to listen to your story, which also has made me a little bit homesick, honestly, seeing the pictures. But I wanted to share a thought, maybe a comment or something to discuss, and that is the heritage of the communist regime. I do agree, obviously, that communism is present in the world, but it does have a different face, like we see in China, what you describe with the church in back then Czechoslovakia under communist regime. They have the same system. They have priests that are official. There are priests that are unofficial. I would argue we need to support those that are authentic Catholic priests and not those who kind of comply with the regime. However, like my point is the face of communism might be different, and there might be actually forces that are today opposed openly to communism, but using the same kind of tools that the regime used, such as restrictions of the free speech. So just to point it out, coming from there, I think makes me kind of sensitive to restrictions like that. But thank you very much for the presentation. Maybe someone wants to comment on that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad if somebody wants to comment on that. My observation, also would be, thus it ever was. I mean, that was the situation with the rise of Nazism in the late 1930s, where, a lot of the political base, for Hitler at that time and the other fascist regimes were opposition to communism, and yet, they obviously did not have clean hands in that fight. But that's a pretty pedestrian comment, so maybe somebody could do a little better than that.
Oh, you have a separate question. No, I have a question. Okay. Did you have a comment? Thank you. Okay. Tanya Youngberg. I have the pleasure of going to Prague every year for work because I'm a lawyer at Radio Free Europe, which still exists for now. But the role of faith in your story was so interesting to me because today the Czech Republic is one of the least religious countries in Europe, unlike neighboring Poland, which is one of the most religious countries in Europe. And I just wanted you to maybe talk about how your family has preserved and passed on faith as part of your Czech heritage, since it seems like that's not necessarily a feature for all people of Czech heritage in the US or in the Czech Republic.
Sure. Well, I think the main example of faith when I was growing up was actually my grandmother, Anton Svoboda's wife, Eva, who, it was interesting. I was saying to somebody the other week, I don't think I ever had a conversation with my grandmother about faith or the doctrines of the faith or anything like that ever, like in my life. And she, lived until I was about 29 years old. But her faith was manifest. She would say the rosary every Saturday night with the other women, at St. Mary's Parish in David City, Nebraska. She'd go to Mass on Saturday night. There was a Knights of Columbus crucifix that hung over the doorway into her kitchen, which now is over the doorway to my kitchen. And I think it was an example of living the faith through example. She didn't have to talk about it. She just did it. And that example proved very influential, I think, to me in the development of my faith, and I hope to my children also, even though she, had never met them. So I think the reception of that tradition and the desire to live it, even when one lives it imperfectly at times, is something that has an effect that one doesn't understand while they're trying to do that.
Thank you again for your talk. I know we all appreciate it. During more the top of your talk, you were speaking to how during Soviet Czechoslovakia, there is kind of this maybe split personality. It's the public side that goes along with the Soviet idea, the communist idea that you have to live under, but then there's also your personal faith, and you're also. So can you address how priests handled that? Because after all, they're men of God, and with a collar, the Soviet regime would see that. Did you get any clue as to how clergy handled the duality of how they had to live?
Well, in Bishop Molly's case, when he was Father Molly, and in Monsignor Hollick's case, they did it by living their vocations underground. So Father Molly in the late 1970s, 1980s, he would say Mass when he was able during the week by going to people's apartments and saying it in secret when he otherwise could have been arrested for doing that. He wasn't supposed to do that. In the case of Monsignor Hollick, he lived his vocation in much the same way. With someone like Cardinal Tomasic, for example, he didn't have that option. I mean, he had to be a public figure, but he was constantly straddling the line between seeming to be pusillanimous with the regime and trying to preserve the unity of the church in Czechoslovakia at the same time. This picture is actually from an awesome book. It's called Prague Through the Lens of the Secret Police. It's an anthology of surveillance photos that were taken by the Czech secret police in the 1970s and 1980s. This is a photo taken by the secret police of Cardinal Tomasic at Christmas Mass in, I think it was 1982. But the cardinal looked for opportunities to convey, strength to other people. So a couple years before the regime collapsed in December of 1987, there was a petition that someone in Moravia had put together, basically seeking expanded rights for the church. Again, along the theory of Charter 77, which is the regime has these purported norms. It purports to have adopted the Helsinki Accords. It has statutes that purport to guarantee religious freedom, and yet they're not doing it. So we're going to call on the regime to do it. And the petition circulates, and unlike many such efforts, in the 20 years preceding, it took off like wildfire. I mean, more than 1 million people signed it. And the cardinal was asked what he thought about it, and he urged people to sign it. He said, "Cowardice and fear are not becoming to a true Christian." And so, again, that sort of authenticity, that unity between thought and act was something that he communicated in that moment. And that was something he did with great difficulty and at great cost. And he was faulted by some, earlier for not doing it aggressively enough. But he found his voice and he spoke when it mattered. Was he punished? I mean, I don't think Cardinal Tomasic was punished in the way that, for example, that Father Molly was. He wasn't imprisoned like Cardinal Mezenti in Hungary, but I mean, he suffered in other consequential ways. I mean, he had no other bishops. I mean, the government and the Vatican were at loggerheads over the appointment of bishops. And so he was left, without, other peers to support him. He had a church that was divided where, again, between the state-sponsored activities and the priests who were faithful to him, and he had to manage that division. So I think his punishment was, interior, and I think it was very grave.
Brian, thank you very much for that. It was a great talk. I have a question. It sounded like Bishop Molly had a lot of questions for you about the American political context and situation. Did he offer any opinions about where we stand today?
I think the bishop, I asked the bishop, what advice would you have for somebody who is going back to the United States? And he said, remember the Czech Republic. I think he sees the United States as having a special relationship with Europe generally and with the Czech Republic particularly, and I think he was concerned that might be less the case. I think is fair to say. I think also you can actually follow Bishop Molly on Facebook, and I think you can get, assuming that Facebook is translating well from the original Czech, as the robots do it. But I think you can get a sense, of what he seeks. I think he would very much, and here I'm more giving my impression than relaying something he actually said, but people approaching current events with sort of a reflectfulness and courage and constructiveness is something that I think he would very much want to see, and that he would find lacking, in our current political discourse.
All right. Well, I think we've come to the end of our program tonight, but it continues with a nice little happy hour where the speaker has provided us with beer from the Czech Republic. So please join us out there for a little. Thank you, Brian Svoboda, and thank you to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for co-sponsoring tonight's event. It's a wonderful story that we just have to remember. So everyone should say a little prayer for the Czech Republic tonight, I think, and just be grateful. Please come back to the CIC. Next Wednesday, we will have an event with Robert Royal on his new book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium, and we have a series of events and our Eucharistic procession coming up on May 17th. And all the good things come from Mass, confessions, adoration, whatever it is you need